This is House Planning Help Episode 2.
Have you always wanted to build your dream home? Maybe you know what you want. But what if it could be better? HousePlanningHelp.com. Speaking to the experts, searching for better ways, planning for the future. Build a better home. HousePlanningHelp.com podcast.
Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and coming up I'll be chatting to Martin Evans from the Malthouse Consultancy. He's an expert in energy efficiency and will be telling us how you can have the house design you want and also the low running costs. Plus, I've created a new LinkedIn group to bring together good build ideas from around the world.
HousePlanningHelp.com.
Thank you for coming back for episode 2. I have to say, after just one episode, it has been unbelievable. The response and the amount of downloads. I'm very excited about this all. And having worked in radio, it's really weird to be building up your own audience. And I like that fact that you are choosing to listen to this. And hopefully that means you're a like-minded person. You do care about the future and everything that we have got to do. A recap, if you didn't listen to the first episode, I want to build my own house. I'd like to make it a house that's built for the future. And I want to put in lots of research, maybe 3 years of research, so that I can have a 1-year build. That is the idea anyway. We'll see how it goes. So this is episode 2. I've got some feedback on the first episode actually, and all sorts of different bits and pieces. We will do this at the end of the podcast, but there is one email that I'd like to read out now. It's not totally connected, but it's what I call a bigger picture email. So I'll read it. It's from Anastasia Witz, and she says, "Dear Ben, we lived in Sovereign Harbour South for 6 years in a rented 2-bedroom house. The property cannot be more than 15 years old, but I found the quality of the building very poor. Even basic insulation was non-existent, the bills were astronomical, plaster walls couldn't take even the weight of a bathroom mirror, we had to amend the holes on a monthly basis, the carpet throughout the house was the cheapest imaginable, and even by the time we moved in, it was worn out. The worst thing was damp and mould. As the house wasn't particularly warm, the fungus developed everywhere regularly, even in the open areas, and hugely behind every piece of furniture. I should also say a thing or two about the design itself. The rooms were very small, and although it claimed to be a 2-bedroom house, you could hardly fit a double bed in the master and a single bed in the other one. There was no dining room, only a small living room, a large part of which was practically unusable as it was under the stairs and you could only reach it by kneeling. The house was probably okay for a single occupancy, but not for a small family as it had been positioned on the market. We loved the area and were looking for a house there, but when the time came, we couldn't afford anything. The properties we viewed were all too expensive, yet small, with very small rooms, lots of doors and corridors, small windows, and altogether it was badly designed space. I can only say that for the money one is prepared to pay for this lovely location, it's not worth it, and you end up in an uncomfortable, badly built property that needs a lot of attention and investment and has very little chance of any renovation or improvement. We finally bought a house which is 11 years old in a new village called Stonecross near Pevensey. It was much better quality and has got a lot more space and was affordable." Anastasia, thank you very much for that lengthy email. But it covers all sorts of things that I think are totally relevant. And the main point is, why are we not building things to last? I really don't like that, because we had that before. Certainly as the UK, I'm not sure what it was like in other parts of the world, but we built things that would go on forever. In fact, I probably still have a few items that are going on, but they're old items. And in the house that I live in, it's a Victorian terrace. The old bit, the Victorian side, is fantastic. The rooms are a good size. But someone tacked on an extension about 15 years ago. And it's rubbish. It's where we get all our problems. When the roof leaks, when there are problems with the flooring, and time and again, it's come back to that supposedly new bit, which should have all the modern technology and be perfect, but no. So that got me thinking. I've set up a LinkedIn group because what I want is for us not to make the same mistakes again, if that's at all possible, to try and say, okay, well, this is what happened in the past. We're not going to point any fingers here, but is there any way we can make sure it doesn't happen again in the future? So I'm after good ideas. If you have good ideas that you see, or if you're after something that you don't want to be repeated again, a small bedroom size. Is there a minimum size that they should be? So all sorts of discussion that I want in this LinkedIn group. I'm hoping it'll be a bit like a mastermind group if you've ever done anything like that before. So I've got details on houseplanninghelp.com of how you can sign up to that. Go and take a look, and I would love you there for a chat. I'll be in there talking as well. But we need to get to our interview now. It's episode 2, and he's from the Malthouse Consultancy, a highly acclaimed independent environmental consultancy, providing advice and project management services to property professionals in the planning, design and construction fields. They have a real mix of clients, from individual homeowners to the largest budget hotel chain in England. Let's find out more.
Houseplanninghelp.com. The interview.
Today I'm with Martin Evans from Malthouse Consultancy in Hampshire, and as we do on this each time we interview someone, we just like a bit of background first of all. So how did you become interested in the energy efficiency field?
Well, I've been in construction all my life. I started as a civil engineer and moved from civils into building. Probably about 20 years ago, we started experimenting with solar panels and higher levels of insulation in houses that we were building for spec for sale, in other words, and developed that process really through to the point where we got to building the house we're sat in, which is a sort of example of a country house that is not compromised by any design constraints, but is built to be as energy efficient as possible.
Is this your dream home?
I guess it is, really. It's the house we always wanted to build for the family, and it's been a wonderful place to live, and it's been interesting to see how low we can drive the energy costs, really.
So maybe it's a good idea for you to tell us what we've got here in front of us, the designs that you have built into your home.
Okay, well, the house is about 6,500 square feet, so it's a reasonably large country house. The design is not compromised by energy constraints, so we set about designing the house that best suited the site to extract the most from the site. It's got lovely views, so there's huge amounts of glass, floor-to-ceiling glass in many rooms. But having worked out the optimum design, we then set about trying to work out how we could make it use the least energy possible. So the main considerations are very high levels of insulation, so a long way above building regulation standards. The house is very carefully air sealed so that there's very little ingress of cold air from the outside during the winter. And one of the disadvantages with that can be that you get stuffy rooms, stuffy atmosphere. So the Canadians have always been very good at mechanical ventilation systems. In fact, they heat and cool their houses in much higher extremes than we're used to, of course, using their system. So I actually imported a Canadian system for the mechanical ventilation for the house. So it's very carefully sealed, a very efficient heat exchanger for the fresh air. So it's bringing fresh air into the house all the time, but preheating it with the outgoing air. So we get a very high quality atmosphere, but using very little energy. And then we've used underfloor heating throughout the whole house, which is fed from a ground source heat pump, which takes the heat from the field. We're luckily here, we're in quite a lot of ground, so we're able to lay ground loops out in the fields. And that provides the main energy source for the heating and for the hot water for the house. So it's 5 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, 6,500 square feet, and the total running costs for the house are less than about £2,000 a year, but that's everything, including lighting, heating, ventilating, cooking, well, everything.
Is this a lifestyle choice, or is this something that you think will become a standard way of living in the future?
I think it is really going to become standard. I think it's people are beginning to understand the art of the possible. You know, we haven't been good with energy in this country. We've not built houses that are deliberately low energy, other than rather odd-looking houses. And the thing that I was keen to demonstrate with this house was that actually you don't need to compromise on the look or the amount of glass or things like that. You just need to be very careful about the way you specify and the way you build, and use common sense in many cases. It's interesting that you can do a lot with lighting. It's moved on. I mean, this house was built nearly 5 years ago now, but of course in that time LED lighting has become much easier to get really good quality LED lighting. So although this is a very low energy lighting system in this house, which has proper dimming control and things, which People don't know often that when you dim a light, it doesn't use less energy in many cases. But if you use properly controlled lighting systems, when you reduce the light to half, it's actually only using half the energy. So it's understanding those issues, but it's probably true that we don't run the lighting here in any room above sort of 30 or 40%, except in very unusual circumstances. If you're reading or something, then obviously you need more light locally. But you find you run a lot of the lighting at much below the full level. So I think there is an element of lifestyle to it. It is what we wanted to create here, but not compromised by anything to do with energy. But we have managed to drive it down to be a very energy efficient house as well, I think.
So your company, your consultancy, you will get asked for advice on certain builds. Is it always new build?
No. And one of the mysteries about ground source is that people will often tell you that you can't use a ground source heat pump or that sort of renewable technology very easily in old houses. But we've got good examples of Tudor houses and many very old houses that can be very efficiently and effectively heated by these sort of renewable technologies. It's a question of making sure that they're done properly in recognising what the house needs to make it run well. And probably the biggest frustration with this industry is you often see a disconnect between the energy supplier, the person who's putting in the heat pump, or, well, let's stick with ground source heat pumps as a good example. You can put in a very good ground source heat pump, which in theory can deliver the right energy for the house. But if the heat emitters within the house aren't matched to give you the optimum performance of that heat pump, you very quickly get a big drop in performance of the heat pump. So you'll still get the house warm, but it'll cost you a lot more in energy. And that's just about not understanding the full process of extraction of energy from the ground and delivery of energy into the houses. If you get the match right with the whole system, right from ground extraction through heat pump specification through to delivery into the house, then I believe you can make pretty much any house very efficient. I mean, clearly, if you've got a very old house where you can't double glaze the windows and you may not be able to change leaded lights, for example, that are a planning constraint that you have to keep them because they're listed, it will have different requirements in terms of how much heat you put into the house, but it's still perfectly possible in most cases to do it with renewable technology.
With an energy efficient house, is it only really energy efficient once it's built? Or what about the process? Is this a much more sustainable system that we're setting up?
Well, certainly with new builds, I'm personally a big fan of timber frame, mainly because there's very little embodied energy in a timber frame structure. It's sustainable in that places like Canada now have a fantastic system of growing the same amount of wood as they extract. So you know for absolute certainty when you buy Canadian wood that it's a completely sustainable process. That may not be quite so true in other places in Europe, but we're moving in that direction. And I think the concept is right, that we can grow as much softwood as we need for construction if we build these methods. So the potential is there for us to make ourselves truly sustainable, and that's much more difficult when you start looking at brick and concrete products because they've got a lot more embedded energy in them. Having said all that, when you actually look at the energy lifetime of a building, the energy we put into heating it and ventilating it and living in it, it makes the energy involved in the actual construction look relatively insignificant. So it's probably right that we should focus more on what the building uses once it's completed than worrying so much perhaps about how much is embedded in the building process.
In that respect, it's a logical conclusion really, isn't it, that people are going to want homes that don't cost that much to run, surely?
Well, I think so. I think all the predictions are that fuel costs are going to go up and up, and I hope that the government will move away from trying to support certain technologies, which has been a temptation, and we've seen it with feed-in tariffs for certain technologies. If that approach is made much more general and it is just applied really as an energy tax, which encourages us to do the right thing, then people will become more and more incentivized to reduce the energy that their buildings or their companies, I do quite a lot of work for big organisations, corporates like hotel groups and things where their energy use is huge. And because of the carbon tax that is being introduced, they are now looking much harder at how they reduce their energy costs. So that to me is the right incentive to help us all. I mean, we may want to do it for sort of altruistic reasons, but also it needs to be financially the right thing to do as well, I think.
Are we using Passive House technology here or not quite?
Pretty much. This house is largely based around the principles of Passive House. And one of the things that is rather disappointing for me, anyway, looking back, is the way people have tried to reinvent different codes and different systems for achieving what we're all trying to achieve, which is lower energy housing. And actually Passive House was there a long time ago, and I still think has the bones of a lot of very good things that we should be applying to all our structures actually that we build. So I'm a big fan of Passive House. We didn't actually certify this building as a Passive House building, but we use many of the technologies or the approaches. And in fact, when you look at the energy use of this house, it exceeds the Passive House standards quite significantly. So whether you use a standard like that, absolutely, or use it as a guide, there are lots of good learnings to be had from things like Passive House.
Are there technologies that you avoid at all that aren't proven in your mind, or would you widely use everything that's on the market?
Well, I think the thing that I do tell people to avoid are things that are done purely for financial reasons. And I'll give an example of the feed-in tariffs associated with photovoltaics. Many of us, and I'm one, have put in a photovoltaic array, but I'm being paid 43.5 pence per kilowatt hour by the government for that array, and I only pay 10p for a kilowatt hour that I buy from the grid. So without that sort of huge level of funding, I wouldn't have done it. And actually, what I think we need to get to is being able to assess what technology delivers the best answer for a particular project. And that's not going to be the same on every scheme. And that's the problem with governments picking a technology and saying, I'm going to support that one. It's not one size fits all. And actually, most of my work is actually spent working with clients, working out where they can most or best apply their energy and efforts and money. There are many simple things that, if I talk about hotels for a minute, hotels are interesting because they're such high energy users. And we've done hotels which have been designed and built from the outset to be the very lowest energy we can make them without changing the customer experience. So nobody would know they've been in an eco hotel. But if you compare the energy take of that compared with a top-end luxurious hotel that's energy is no object approach, we're looking at multiples of carbon footprint for a night stay of 50 times the carbon footprint, which is, I think, pretty staggering. And as people start to understand the choices that they've got to make, would I stay in a hotel that I knew was going to be 50 times the carbon of another one down the road? Okay, it might be a bit simpler and a bit plainer, but still provides me with everything I need. I think those sort of things will come into people's decision making, and it should do. And I think probably organisations will also start to include overnight stays in people's carbon footprint. We often carbon footprint our travel, but at the moment we don't carbon footprint our overnight stays and things. So I think that'll come.
I wonder whether to a large degree it's because people just don't know. I've started out from a position of little knowledge and tried to learn as much as I possibly can and to speak to lots of interesting people who are experts in their individual fields. But you can't tell by looking at something necessarily.
No, I think that's exactly right. And the more we understand about the choices that we have and the real impacts, we've got it right in many cases. Things like transport, we know when we buy a car very clearly. There may be a bit of room for manoeuvre, but not much. You know pretty much what you're getting. When you buy a house or you stay in a hotel or you rent an office block, it's much more difficult. The rating system that we have is rather crude and really probably doesn't tell you enough about it to make a particularly well-informed choice. It's moving in that direction, but an ABCD type approach is probably not sophisticated enough to give you the right sort of level of information. But I think the good operators and the good employers and perhaps the good house buyers and house owners will start to understand enough to be able to work out for themselves and benchmark what they're doing themselves. And there are very good information databases now available on the Carbon Trust website, for example, where you can start to benchmark your energy uses for whatever type of building we're talking about, compared with what are industry standards, and also to see what the potential is, at least in theory, of where you should be aiming. But the more information we give people, the better able they will be to make informed decisions. And I think we'll be surprised that people will actually be more inclined to make the right choice based on some of these issues than perhaps we expect they would be.
What is the uptake like? Is it increasing as we might hope?
I think it is, but the disadvantage or the problems, I think, are that there's lots and lots of examples of these things having gone wrong, where people have spent quite a lot of money, not had the right results. And that's usually about not getting the right advice from people who are properly getting under the skin of what the client wants to achieve, and perhaps not actually being tied into those achievements. If I'm asked to install an air source heat pump for a client because that's what he thinks he wants, then the simplest answer may be just to go on and install it. But I'm not an installer, obviously, but if a client had gone to somebody as a green supplier of heat pumps and things and asked for a particular solution, he will probably get given it, whether it's the right thing for them or not. And the quality of the installation varies so dramatically that I think that's where the biggest resistance or the problem is for people buying at the moment, because most of us, I think, are clear we'd like to do the right thing, but we're not clear how you get there. And until we are able to demonstrate better that we can achieve certain things rather than just having a piece of paper with a coefficient of performance written on it and just saying that's what you're going to get, and actually know that in practice that's not achieved in many, many cases. So I'm a big fan of everybody being able to see how installed projects have actually worked, how well they've worked. And to do that, you need proper data that shows you the energy you've put into the scheme and the energy you've got out of the scheme, so you can see how efficient the whole project or the whole installation is. And unfortunately, not much of that information is around, but I wouldn't buy from companies who can't demonstrate to me seasonal figures showing how well their installations have performed.
Well, it's interesting that you've just mentioned that, because I plan to build my own energy efficient house in the next 4 years, and that's why I'm building up all this knowledge. But in my particular case, I'd just be after a little bit of advice about how you think I should go about it. So maybe first, if I was going to pick someone who knew about energy efficiency, how do I know that they're not one of these people that won't actually install it properly? How do I pick?
Well, as I say, a starter for 10 for me is that you wouldn't pick a contractor unless they can show you some good, real data of installations that they've done. But actually, I think going back before that, you don't really want to be talking to people who are trying to sell you a technology. Your initial exercise should be done from unbiased advice that's not facing in any particular direction. So when you've picked a site, the site in itself will have some opportunities, so you may have opportunities to orientate the house in a particular way, or, for example, to increase the eaves overhang so that you don't get so much solar gain, because more and more houses in modern times, of course, are looking for cooling to be incorporated, which, if you do that with air conditioning, flies in the face of everything that we're all trying to do, really, because air conditioning is not good news for energy take. And I think in places like America, they now spend more money and more energy on cooling than they do on heating. And we shouldn't be heading in that direction, and we could design that out. But also there are ways of making very efficient levels of comfort cooling in a house without really using much energy. And I mean simultaneous heating and cooling. We all use quite a lot of hot water, and if at the same time as we're generating hot water, we're generating cold water, then it's a free byproduct of the process if we do it right. So you don't want a gas boiler heating your hot water cylinder and an air conditioning unit cooling your lounge, for example. We can be much smarter about that, and the whole efficiency of the whole system becomes dramatically better once we capture those sort of benefits.
Do I think about house design first or energy efficiency design?
Well, I think it's a good principle to have energy as part of, one of the bullets on your early meetings when you sit down to think about this project. Energy should be a consideration right from the outset. I don't support the fact that you have to design the building to be the smallest external wall for the internal space you're trying to get, because that would have compromised too much the design. So the design needs to maximise the benefits that the site has. That's top of my list, is to say, when we build houses, particularly housing, you're trying to make the very best of the site that you have available to you. Once you've started to do that, then there are things you can do in the design process to make sure that house will be very energy efficient. And if it's a house like this where you've got lots of views and you want lots of glass, then the specification of the windows and the doors becomes obviously much more important. And it's interesting that there are some fantastic products out there now which are not a substantial premium above what would be a traditional window. If I give an example of, many people would specify a window which would have a U value of say 1.5 or so, and say that's a good window. But actually, now we can buy windows that maybe cost 20% more, but lose half the energy that window would lose if you'd stuck with that specification. So by searching around and finding good suppliers, and there are quite a lot of them now who do these really high quality, low energy loss units, you can improve. And of course they last a huge amount of time. We should be talking about a product that'll still be performing well in 40 or 50 years time. So making that in a house where you've got lots of windows, if you can halve the energy loss through the windows, that's a big step in the right direction. Technology is probably quite a long way down the list of things you do when you're developing your ideas for your house. You design it right, you specify it right, you insulate it as highly as you possibly can, you seal it as best you can, you mechanically ventilate it with the most efficient system you can find, and none of those things have really cost you a lot of money. They're all relatively small cost items. And at the very end of that falls out the energy requirement that the house has, which will then be a lot less than it would have been if you hadn't followed that sort of process. So you end up with a much lower energy requirement, and you can then look at what's the best, most efficient way I can produce that. And that might be an air source heat pump or a ground source if you have room, or it may be a very small gas boiler is the most efficient solution to that particular house. There's no one size fits all. It's a question of following the common sense path to getting the right answer for a particular project, I think.
And finally, do you think there's anyone else that I should be speaking to? It doesn't necessarily have to be along the energy efficiency lines, but knowing that you have done this, you've built your own house, I suppose you've been in construction before that for a long time. Who do you think might be worth, or what type of person might be worth speaking to?
Well, I think people who have data, real data about how things perform are very useful. And there's a huge range of people out there now who actually do know how things have performed in their own houses and are actually usually quite keen to share that information. You have to be a little cautious because people are always very keen to show that what they did was right rather than accept that it may not have been the perfect answer. And interesting little example is I visited someone who had some solar panels, and because he had solar panels, he'd turned off his boiler and he was heating his water by electricity. And that's a sort of rather bizarre set of showing of the way people sort of interpret things they've done and maybe believe some of the jargon they've been told or some of the information they've been fed along the way. It's really important to understand what you are generating, if you're generating, how you can use that and what percentage of the overall it actually delivers. In the case I'm talking about, the solar panels actually were not doing anything like enough for the whole house, so it would still have been the right thing to have had the boiler running the water, of course, much lower carbon footprint if you'd done that. But that was just because he didn't understand. So getting out and talking to people who've tried things, looking at their data, making sure you understand their data and are able to interpret it and get a real feeling for how that has benefited the particular project is quite important. I don't know, it is quite difficult finding good places to get information because most people are out there trying to promote some particular technology, and that's not where you want to be focused. You need to be above that level and working out what you want and then finding the best people to supply it. So I'm not giving you many places to go, am I? But Evidence-based design is one of my fundamentals, and properly presented evidence-based information is hugely valuable. So there are lots of places to dig around for that, but scrutinise it with real care before you believe it.
Well, some brilliant advice there. Martin, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Good luck.
Another industry expert on houseplanninghelp.com.
To find out more about Martin and the Malthouse Consultancy, you can head to malthouse.net. We'll put a link in the show notes as well at houseplanninghelp.com. It's time for some feedback, and I was chatting to Jason Lintott on Facebook. He's an architect and he enjoyed the first podcast that we did, but one of his comments was he'd like a little bit more detail. And I think this is very valid. There is one issue. I'm not sure I'm ready for more detail yet. But the good thing is, because we're interviewing experts, every time we get someone on and they say, well, actually, go and look at this website or this resource. So there is a way around that I will just give you an overview of the subject and then you can go to the experts. I'll lead the way on the website, houseplanninghelp.com. But maybe in future, I might be more knowledgeable and I can ask highly technical questions and we can get into it if that's what you want, but we shall see. Also on the last session, I asked you for your top 3 tips if you'd been through the building process before, perhaps you'd commissioned a custom build, and Carol from France sent me 7 tips. It's good. It's some great information here, so much so that I've put it into an article on the website, so you can go and have a look at the full 7 tips. But the top 3, for a large project, hire an architect or a contractor whom you trust. He should help you choose all your subcontractors and advise you on every aspect of the building. Second tip, think a long time about exactly what you want, the amount of space, the type of house, how you will use your home, and what you'll be willing to pay. This will be invaluable information for your architect and will be the key to your satisfaction with the work. Tip 3, hire the best, preferably local subcontractors you can afford. A good job done saves lots of grief later. Also, good local subcontractors, such as plumbers, electricians, painters, will continue to be your handymen later and will feel responsible for their work. Brilliant tips, and as I mentioned, more online. If you have completed your own house build, then you are eligible to send me some tips as well, and we would love that. One final bit of feedback in the form of an iTunes review that I wanted to read out. We had lots on there, so brilliant. Thank you to everyone who did that. If you'd like to do it now, I would welcome that. Ben Adam Smith's first instalment of this new podcast on progressive building design and construction is both informative and accessible. With an honest and down-to-earth approach, this podcast promises to give people the answers to the questions they didn't know to ask. We desperately need to be reassessing the way we design and build our homes, and hopefully this podcast will go some way towards highlighting gains in building and retrofitting for a sustainable future. And Green Blue Daisy wrote that review, putting me under pressure a bit. No, we're going to do our best. Next time on the podcast from houseplanninghelp.com, we're starting a mini-series on Passive House. We've touched on this standard a few times already, but we're going to explore it in a bit more depth. My guest will be Pat Wilkinson from Touchwood Homes. He's played a part in building what we think is the world's most airtight home. Ooh. So we look forward to that, and we hope you can join us next time.
You've been listening to Ben Adam Smith on the path to build a better home. Sign up now to the free email newsletter. Head to houseplanninghelp.com.